All right. First, I would like to thank Alessandro Piccolo for his invitation and all the colleagues of La Sapienza-Università di Roma for their invitation. It's always so nice to be in Rome, to be back in Rome. Even today, it's virtually, but it's very nice to be with you. And I would like to thank you again for this invitation. The question of debt and credit is indeed a very important question. It was a very important question for the ancient societies. And beyond Michael Hudson's own work, much attention has been paid recently to the question of debt in the ancient world. Of course, I'm thinking here of the book of the late David Graeber, Debt, the First 1,000 Years, published in 2011, and the recent volume edited by John Weisweiler, Debt in the Ancient Mediterranean and Near East, Credit, Money, and Social Obligation. Right. I will approach the question of credit through a different lens, that of interest rates. Today, credit is at the heart of economic life. Although ancient economies were not capitalist, this doesn't mean that credit and interest rates didn't play an important role in their development. The comparatively low interest rates of the ancient Greek cities and the benefits they provided are the focus of this study. I try to use my slides. Now I have a few slides, not too many, I hope. What is a loan? A loan is fundamentally an agreement between the lender and the borrower. It implies that the borrower agrees to repay the amount borrowed. The loan may be interest-free or it may include interest. The reason for taking out a loan vary. In the modern world, credit falls into main categories: consumer and commercial, the latter being used for day-to-day needs or for investment. In the ancient Greek world, these distinctions are not so easy to make, and the case of agriculture, by far the largest production sector in the ancient economy, deserves special attention. Farms were both consumption and production units. For individual farmers, whether owners or tenants, a bad harvest had harmful consequences. They had to borrow grain and other food to feed their families. This is what we could call consumer credit. But since the family members were the primary producers themselves, getting the food to keep the family alive was also a form of business credit. In addition, farmers might also need to borrow seed, and the point remains that a grain loan in these conditions blur the distinction, our modern distinction between consumer credit or commercial and investment credit. If possible, farmers borrowed from their neighbors, and this is famously known from Hesiod's works and days. Otherwise, they had to borrow from wealthier landowners who had surpluses to sell or lend, even in the face of poor harvests. Before the generalization of precious metal money, loans in kind were the most common form of credit, and they continued to exist at a local level well after the archaic or classical period. Except in situation of crop failure, agriculture was not directly dependent on credit for its production cycle. The logic of internalizing costs and avoiding buying and borrowing was that of Hesiod around 700 BCE, but it remained unchanged throughout the existence of Greek cities, even as a fully developed silver-based monetization emerged, and it remained also in the same condition in ancient Rome. By contrast, in the world of artisans and merchants, despite the desire to minimize costs, of course, the use of credit was constant and central to operations. Given the different business cycles, small traders often had no cash advance and had to borrow to buy the goods they would resell in the agora. Artisans certainly often behaved similarly, and merchants who engaged in long-distance trade had to take large bottomry loans. Another feature of credit in the urban world is that in addition to loans taken out because of poverty or productive activity of some kind, many others were taken out to meet social obligations. Wealthy people who owned large land properties and had invested money in trade, handicraft, etc., silver mining, for instance, in Athens, could find themselves short of cash to make exceptional payments. These could be expenses of private nature, such as, for instance, paying a dowry for a daughter, or of a public nature. The form of social pressure changed over time, but the need for the rich to make frequent contributions to the welfare of the community remained the same. Some were compulsory, such as the payment of taxes, the choregia, that is financing the choruses that performed during the dramatic festival, and the trierarchia, or equipping and maintaining a worship. Monetary contributions, the epidoseis, for specific purposes, such as the construction of repair of walls for the defense of the city or public buildings, and the creation of grain funds, or for other purposes, were officially voluntary. In practice, social pressure left wealthy people no choice but to promise to contribute. In addition, special circumstances, especially those in connection with war, led cities to levy extraordinary taxes. This was the case with the eisphorei, property taxes levied on those who owned significant amounts of land. And then people had to borrow, even the rich people had to borrow. In addition to individual cities could also borrow money. They could do so to meet wartime emergencies, to finance the purchase of grain, or to establish a purchasing fund, to build fortifications and various other buildings, such as other reasons, such as financing festival or embassies. The lenders could sometimes be sanctuaries, such as the sanctuary of Apollo at Delos, and we see some of the cities that borrow from the sanctuary of Delos at the end of the second half of the 4th century BCE. Members of the civic community could also contribute to a loan by organizing a subscription. Finally, cities could also borrow from rich individuals who were usually foreigners. As already observed for cities, the sources of private credit could be diverse, and the system combined both non-institutional and institutional sources. In a Greek world, well, when individuals wanted to borrow money, they usually turned first to their circle, the family circle, and friends. They could also hope to obtain an interest-free loan from a tontine, a group of people, an eranos, who would agree to advance their money for free, without interest. I could go even further in this direction. There were many forms of, many sources of credit in the world of the classical and Hellenistic cities. We should also stress, for instance, the importance of the role of private and public foundations. One example is the funds created to finance cultic ceremonies ad perpetuum in honor of deceased family members. Another is the endowment funds created by cities to finance grain distributions to their citizens. The case of the city of Miletus, which had created a fund to lend money specifically to merchants, was probably an exception. But funds created by the city or through gifts from private benefactors were a common source of credit. The capital was never used to carry out the activities for which the foundation were created, for instance, sacrifices. It was always the profits from the interest on the loans that were used for this purpose. In sum, credit was ubiquitous in the ancient Greek world for the poor out of necessity, for the rich to meet their social obligations, or for both to engage in economic activity, albeit in agriculture, with timing tied to the specific way in which the production cycle was organized. Interest rates and their evolution in a comparative perspective. Our information on interest rates in the Greek world, and more generally in the ancient world, is patchy. Some of it comes directly from the specification of loan contracts, but some of it reaches us through social impact or economic consequences of credit. In many cases, we have no information about the prevailing conditions. Interest could also be hidden in the amount lent in cases in which the lender transferred to the borrower an amount less than the sum specified in the contract. It was a way to conceal the interest. An exceptionally bad harvest or a war could trigger a temporary massive increase in interest rates, which was not in line with which was customary at the time. This is the difficulty for us. We don't have the big picture very often. Moreover, the interest rate was also a function of the reliability of the borrower and the guarantees he or she could offer, about which we often have no information. Means in the same city, in the same period, people would have different interest rates when they borrow money. Despite these difficulties, general trends can be identified. The question of interest rates in the Greek world must also be placed in the perspective of longue durée through a comparison with interest rates in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Rome. For Mesopotamia, the question of whether interest rates were calculated on an annual basis has been much debated by Van der Merwe, Vargas, Charpin, and others. Loans in grain were certainly supposed to be repaid after the new harvest, and if repayment was not possible, one had to wait for the next one, of course. For loans in silver, interest could be determined on a monthly basis according to the duration of the loan, which allows us to calculate an annual rate. According to Hammurabi's code, around 1750 BCE, the maximum interest rates in Babylon were set at 33% for grain and 20% for silver. There were also regional variations. For the city of Mari in the upper Euphrates Valley in the same years, same period as Hammurabi, the annual interest rate on silver was 30%, 10% more than in Hammurabi's code. Rates, just as those defined in Hammurabi's code, seem to have remained traditional in Mesopotamia, although this does not mean that they always remain exactly at the same level. Leaving aside the complex evolution of interest rates in the first half of the first millennium in Babylonia, under the Achaemenids at the end of the 6th century, interest rates on silver were commonly at 20%. Later, in the 5th and 4th century, they increased, often reaching 40%. Our information on these questions are to be found in Michael Diosa's big book on Mesopotamia of 2010, and in the book by Haeckel, in an article by Haeckel and Pierre Grumber of 2014. For Egypt, our documentation is less abundant than for Mesopotamia. Thanks to Brian Muse, however, in his book of 2016, we have some very important indication. Interest rates were significantly higher in the Seirite and Persian periods than in Mesopotamia. For grain, one loan in 498 BCE had an interest rate of 50% for 2 months and 120% per year if not repaid. Another one in 487 BCE had a rate of 50% for repayment at the lender's request, and one in 402 BCE stipulates 100% a month later. For silver, the lowest interest rate is 33% under Pharaoh Eprius in 570, and then under the Achaemenids, the interest rates were, varied a lot. They were around for in-kind loans. We have 2 loans at 60% in the first half of the 5th century, and 2 others at 120% in 487. So we have very high interests in rates for grain loans in Achaemenid Egypt. Regarding Greece and archaic Greece, it must first be said we know very little about the archaic period. At the end of the 7th and beginning of the 6th century BCE, we know that Athens experienced a period of social crisis. Loans could be secured against the land and person of the debtor, who could not only lose his land, but also be sold as a slave outside Attica if he could not repay his debt. The situation of the ektemoros could have been that of a peasant who was forced to give up his land to a rich landowner. The famous case of that is referred to by Plutarch, all the common people who are in debt to the rich and the situation. And to solve the social crisis in 594-593, the Archon Solon took several measures known as sexaiteia, shaking off of burdens. He freed the land, which was a slave, forbade taking a loan secured on the person of the debtor, and forbade enslavement for debt. The actual scope of these measures is debated. Most ancient authors, beginning with the author of the Aristotelian Constitution of the Athenians, believe that Solon cancelled all debts. Plutarch quotes the local Attic historian Androtion as claiming that Solon lowered interest rates rather than cancelling all debts, although he doesn't adopt this view. Well, whatever. We don't know. We know that there were debts, that they were high, that there may be a lowering interest rates, possibly, but we don't know what the level of the interest was. What can we add maybe on this period of Solon? Well, maybe in this period, we can be fairly certain that the weighed silver began to circulate in mainland Greece before the introduction of coinage around 550-540 BCE. And it could be used both as a unit of account as a means of payment. But it was still very rare, which is confirmed that we know of prices expressed in silver, which were very low compared to later period because of the scarcity of silver. Given this rarity, credit must have been given in kind more frequently than in cash, which is consistent with the situation prevailing in Mesopotamia and Egypt, where interest rates were very high. A parallel with the situation in early Republican Rome can help us in this perspective. Late Archaic and early Classical Rome had a system of debt bondage, nexum, which could lead to outright enslavement, just like in Athens. Nexum was properly the remedy for non-payment of a debt. In the 5th century, the social situation was particularly tense, and due to a series of famines, many poor people had to borrow from rich landowners and were unable to repay their debts, and they were sold abroad as slaves. The parallel with Athens is perfect. This means that we had a situation of very high level of interest rates. Tacitus, in his Annals, emphasizes that until the promulgation of the law of the 12 tables in the mid-5th century, interest was free, but that that the rate of interest was free in the sense the rate of interest was free. It means that as he says, the rate of interest was governed by the caprice of the rich. But the law of the 12 tables established that it should not exceed 1 ounce. This is the famous case of Venus Unciarium. The meaning of this rate has long been misunderstood. The Venus Unciarium is literally the interest of 1 ounce per libra, and the libra at 12 unciae. The interest was not 1/12% or 8.33%, which has been very long. People have thought that this was a real interest rate, but in fact, as explained by Tsenaka and Pikulska, it was in fact a rate of 100%. Which justifies, of course, the difficulties, and which is perfectly in line with what we have in Egypt or Mesopotamia. And a possible suggestion for Athens, that rates of this magnitude were possible, just is demonstrated by the parallel of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Later, in the 4th century, there were slightly lower rates, however, still at 50%. In classical Greece, there was fundamental difference between maritime yield, what was defined as nautikos tokos, and land yield, engeios tokos. Maritime yield corresponded to bottomry loans or loans that were assimilated to them. The interest was not calculated on a time basis, but on a business class to be performed. The interest could vary according to the risk involved. Cases illustrated in 4th century Athens show that interest could vary from 12.5% to 30% for this nautikos tokos, very high risk interest. By contrast, we had land yields corresponding to ordinary loans taken for local purposes within the boundaries of the cities, and these were calculated on a time basis. They involved less risk and were usually set epidrachmae at 1 drachma, implying just the same calculation as in Rome, 1 drachma per mina worth 100 drachmas per month, or 12 drachmas per year. 1 drachma per month, 12 drachma per year. With a mina of 100 drachmas, you have an interest of 12 drachmas per year. The dichotomy observed in classical Athens between land and maritime yields remained standard in the Greek-speaking Eastern Mediterranean world until the imperial period. So we have this distinction between engeios, nautikos kopos, and nautikos tokos. I would like to add maybe something. The poorer members of the community, those who had no significant property to pledge as security for repayment of the loan, but who faced the absolute necessity of borrowing, were the victims of usurers, who charged them very high interest rates. A good case was that of the shopkeepers who, according to Theophrastus, and perhaps with some exaggeration, but not sure after all, had to take out short-term loans at an interest rate of 25% per day to buy the goods they resold in the agora, which of course significantly affected their profits. Such extraordinarily high rates are typical of usury, which is commonly practiced in traditional societies at the expense of the poorest members of the community. In Athens, we have no trace of a law limiting interest rates, but at Delphi, we have a law dating from the early 4th century BCE that forbade lending at more than 8.57% annual interest on pain of very heavy penalties. The law applied to everyone, collectively and individually, regardless of their legal status. Interestingly, the law also added that it would be possible to lend the small sum of 12 drachmas, apparently at an annual interest rate of 25%. And once again, but this time in accordance with the law, small sums were lent at a much higher interest rate. The law shows that before it was enacted, interest rates at Delphi were generally above 8.58%. Afterwards, the local interest rate was lower than the Athenian rate, which was, as I said, at around 12%. This is an indication of the diversity of interest rates in the various cities of the Greek world, although they were apparently in the same range. Let's say between 10 and 12% in the classical period. In the 4th century, the sanctuary Delos, an island under Athenian control, led to a number of Aegean cities at a rate of 10%. This is the map I showed you recently. In the Hellenistic period, interest rates in mainland Greece, the Aegean Islands and Western Asia Minor, were slightly lower than in the 4th century, between around 3.25 and 2.75 BCE. The cities of the islands of Amorgos were expected to pay 12% interest on 2 loans, 10% on one, and 8.5% on another. So you see there is a variation around 10. Ephesus, around 300 BCE, 8.33% and 7.14% for farmers. We have other examples. I don't need to detail all that, maybe in the Aegean at around 10%. At Thera, at the end of the 4th century, interest, the rates on loans of the foundation created by Epicteta was 7%. And at Delphi, in 160, 159 BCE, it was 6.65% for a foundation to fund the city school. So you see, you have something which is slightly below the level of the classical period, around 12-10 in the classical period. Here we are around 8%, let's say 10-8% in the Hellenistic period. And we could maybe add the interest rates in late Republican Rome, which were around 9 to 5%, again, slightly below what we have in the Hellenistic period. These concealed extraordinary variations, we have also cases of very high rates temporarily, or very low rates, lower than 5% in Rome in extraordinary circumstances. But I try to give you the general trend. Now, we must go a bit further and try to provide some explanation for these differentials between interest rates and what were the effects of these differences between interest rates. So what do we have? Try to summarize what we saw in two short graphs, small graphs. The first one is the interest rates on grain loans. And you see what I mentioned in Achaemenid Egypt, 120, 100, early Rome, 150, Achaemenid Mesopotamia, 33%, if indeed the Hammurabi law code was respected. Interest rates that are between 120 and 33. What about interest rates on cash, in cash? So we have significantly lower interest rates, although sometimes high for Egypt, also 120, 160%. For Mesopotamia, we have interest rates at the end of the 6th century, which are at 20%, which is lower than maybe one expected, but at 40% in the 4th century, so higher than in the 6th century. And by contrast, you see the profile of classical Greece, Hellenistic Greece, and late Republican Rome. Great. So what do we have? We have a difference between interests on grain loans, which are higher, significantly higher than those on cash loans. And on the whole, we have a difference between region, but above all, a chronological evolution between very high interest rates and in classical Hellenistic and late Republican Rome, significantly lower interest rates. How can we explain this situation? Well, there are various interpretations have been provided. Gustav Billeter, in his famous book about Zinsfuss of 1898, a book which is now outdated, but that everyone still uses because it still provides useful information. So Gustav Billeter put the emphasis on risk, on the decisions of the lenders based on what would be defined as opportunity costs, and underlying these decisions on the average capitalization rate, that is the rate of profit for the period. Raymond Bogart focused on Greece, and he explained what for him was the very high interest rates of classical Greece by a shortage of coins, implying the evolution of the money supply was the driver of interest rates. But he focused on Greece, did not seriously compare the rates of Greece with what we saw in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt. So the question of very high interest rates can be maybe questions. Paul Millet, in a famous book about lending and borrowing in Athens, 1991, acknowledges that the interest rates in classical Athens were relatively low compared to ancient Mesopotamia and India. But in the case of Athens, he claims they were not defined by risk and profit rates, but by social distance, that is, by the social proximity, the friendship of the borrower to a possible creditor. This would explain how interest rates could remain unchanged and, so to speak, customary. So if you have a friend who is very rich, you're close to him, you'll have favorable rates. If you're not close to him, you will maybe have higher rates. That's quite possible indeed, but they remain to explain the bigger let's say evolution. Moreover, in an unacknowledged strict monetarist orthodoxy, he rejects the idea that the evolution of the money supply could have an effect on interest rates. If the money supply were to expand, prices would follow in a parallel fashion, and the price of money would remain the same, according to him. But once again, this doesn't explain the difference he notes between Mesopotamia and Greece. Michael Hodson, in his book of 2000 gives a technical explanation, I would say, for these differences. I quote, "It was an accidental byproduct of the numerical fraction system in each region," but he will tell us more, of course, in his own paper. And finally, Andreas Walzer, rather than focusing on the stability of knowledge of uniformity of interest rates in Greece, he underlines their variability over the same period, which he explained by the meeting of supply and demand in market system. It's possible, but it doesn't explain the difference between Mesopotamia and Egypt. So I will try to propose you a new explanation, one that puts the emphasis on credit supply and demand and on monetization rather than on money supply alone. Let us begin with some basic definitions. First, interest rates are a function of the supply of and demand for credit. Interest rates are negatively correlated with the supply and positively correlated with the demand for credit. Second, in monetized economies, interest rates are also affected by inflation and deflation. In a situation of inflation, an increase of the money supply that is both very rapid and unaccompanied by an increase in the supply of output, of production, but this triggers a brutal rise in prices situation, which is familiar to us. Money tends to lose its value, and lenders raise interest rates to protect themselves against future losses if interest rates remain unchanged, unless for some reason the supply of credit remains far in excess of the demand for it. A situation that we know very well, again, in our contemporary world. Connecting these two propositions suffices to show the supply of credit cannot be simply equated with the supply of money. This also demonstrates the need to separate long-term trends from short-term economic conditions. The monetization of the societies in question was very different. In Egypt and Mesopotamia, precious metals, especially silver, were comparatively rare. These countries did not produce silver, which before the creation of the vast Achaemenid Empire could only be obtained through long-distance trade or by plundering the precious metal reserves of neighbors. The Achaemenid Empire not only continued to import precious metals, but also managed to control some mines. Aegean Greece, especially with the silver mines of Lorient and the gold of silver mines of northern Greece and northwestern Asia Minor, was in a more favorable situation. From the end of the 6th century onward, silver and gold production increased enormously in the Aegean. And in the middle and late Republican periods, Rome was able to import massive quantities of silver, especially from the Iberian Peninsula. But reducing, once again, the debate to a simple question of quantity would be a dead end. One would have to face the above-mentioned monetarist objection. The increase in the money supply triggers in parallel an increase in prices, and at best interest rates remain stable, and they may temporarily increase following bursts of inflation. Indeed, prices in Athens rose significantly in the 5th century. Between 450 and 432, a mere 18 years, during the period of massive growth in the money supply, the salaries of civic officials increased by 50%, before suffering significant cuts at the end of the century following defeats and the impossibility of exploiting the loyal minds. Pseudo-Iamblichus, an author of the mid-classical period, whose thesis found an echo in Xenophon, already presented his own version, if I dare say, of what is now known as the quantity theory of money. You may read this on the screen. The first outcome that arises from law and order, eunomia, is trust, pistis, which brings great benefits to everyone and is ranked among the main goods. On the basis of trust, money, kremata, can be shared, and even if it is scarce, it is sufficient because it is circulated, whilst without it, it is insufficient, even if there is plenty. Pseudo-Iamblichus implicitly introduced the criteria of the velocity of money. In a framework of the Fisher equation, we have mv equals py, where m stands for money supply, v for velocity, p for price level, and y for output. For pseudo-Iamblichus, the decisive factor is v, the velocity of transactions, which is conditioned by trust, pistis, per se. M is worthless if V decreases because of disorder and uncertainty. So the Iamblichus then connected the evolution of the money supply to credit and implicitly to interest rates. I quote what you have on the screen: the changes in access to money, the favorable and unfavorable ones, are steered for men in the most fitting way through law and order. Those who are successful may enjoy their money in security in without fear, and those who do not succeed may be helped by those who are successful for the pooling of money and trust that arises from law and order. Pseudo-Iamblichus makes his remark from the perspective of short-term developments in the context of a Greek city, and he distinguished between period of crisis, when the velocity of money plummeted, and periods of good government, when it returned to normal. But his analysis invites a closer examination of money and the credit supply in pre-Hellenistic Mesopotamia and Egypt, and in the classical Hellenistic Greek world. The comparison between loans in kind in Mesopotamia and Egypt before the Hellenistic period, where the former are comparatively high, and often higher than loans in cash, provides a clue. Cash has the potential to lead to lower interest rates, a factor that was already in the background of Hammurabi's law mentioned at the beginning of this talk. This development is confirmed by the case of Rome and its transition from grain money or bronze money to silver coinage. In the 5th century, Rome had an essentially rural and traditional economy in which transaction in kind still played an important role, and cast bronze was an imperfect monetary instrument. Interest rates were very high. 4 centuries later, Rome produced silver in huge quantities. The number of denarii in circulation in second half of the 1st century BCE, the volume was absolutely enormous, 5 to 10 times higher than 1 century earlier. It's a rapid increase at the end of the Republican period. And in the same period, interest rates plummeted. However, this observation still does not explain the difference in interest rates between society based on in-kind transactions and those based on cash transactions, nor does it explain the difference in interest rate between society that commonly use silver as a monetary tool though in different forms, such as late Babylonian and Achaemenid Mesopotamia and classical Hellenistic Greece. What needs to be examined is the form of credit supply. In an in-kind economy, a bad harvest puts poor farmers at the mercy of large landowners. In such situations, the demand for credit is inelastic, and the creditors can demand extraordinarily high interest rates because it's a matter of survival for the poor guys who have to borrow. Situation was no different for the poorer members of the civic communities who could not offer a solid guarantee for the loans they had to take out, and thus became the victim of usurers and pawnbrokers. But globally, in an economy that uses silver money, the ability of individuals to store value in the form of metal increases the elasticity of credit demand. In the event of a bad harvest or failed business venture, farmers, craftsmen, or merchants could use their cash reserves to weather the storm, if I dare say. For these reasons, silver was preferred to bronze because it was much better serving as a medium of exchange and, above all, as a store of value. Also, the sheer quantity of silver, a precious metal, matters. If silver is too scarce, its value is very high, and the propensity to save it rather than spend it or lend it increases. If they do lend, people prefer to lend in kind, in grain, in fact, rather than in cash. This is why a purely monetarist approach to the question would fail to explain what is at stake in minimally silverized societies. Quantity also matters. The difference in interest rates between civilized society that had not introduced coinage and those that had introduced coinage needs to be explained. What difference did coinage make in the demand for credit? Coinage was introduced under the form of electrum in Western Asia Minor around 650 BCE. And silver coinage was minted in increasing quantities from the end of the Archaic period. Silver was widely used in the Greek world, and silver coinage became the standard means of payment and store of value. The cities guaranteed the value of the coin, which was a major advantage over Hangsilber, the irregularly cut silver bullion that was used in the East, in the Levant, in Mesopotamia, etc., or in Egypt. And the value of this Hangsilber, these pieces of silver, remain always uncertain. Together with the standardization of the weight, this created confidence in the exchange process and accelerated the velocity of money. No less important, perhaps more important, the city enforced the use of coinage for payment, as it is explicitly stated in a decree of Olbia dated around 340, 330. You have to use the coins of silver and bronze of the city to purchase anything in the agora. So the holders of money necessarily had to circulate coinage in order to carry out their transactions. So in a society like a civic Greek society, people are forced to circulate their silver. Cities were therefore places of general exchange and trust. Coined silver money was circulated by the city. All the smaller cities made the coins of the larger cities legal tender, and not all the cities maintained coinage. And everyone could and effectively did have access to coinage. Introducing a coinage was not only a technical matter. Coinage was an institution that brought members of a civic community into communication with one another. Wealthier people could accumulate reserves that they could lend for any purpose, economic or social. Given the large number of money holders and potential creditors, lenders didn't have a monopoly, which lowered lending rates. Compared to Mesopotamia or Egypt, Greece's low interest rates were in themselves a great economic stimulus. Thus, the secret of the success of the Greek city-state economy with regard to money was not only the enormous increase in the volume of silver, although this factor played a role. It was also the fact that the form of money circulation, that is coinage, enforced by the city, and the legally egalitarian and representative civic social structure made it accessible to everyone, as explained by Pseudo-Iamblichus. And that we find again in Aristotle's Politics and Nicomachean Ethics, when he insisted on the role of friendship, philia, favor, gratitude, charis in civic life. Beyond the beautiful words means something that people could borrow money from from their fellow citizens. Egypt and Mesopotamia were in a different situation. And the case of Mesopotamia is the most telling. Mesopotamia had imported silver over long distances, at least since the early second millennium. The Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian kingdoms in the 6th century extracted large tributes in silver from the territories they subjugated. And later, the Achaemenids did the same in the various provinces of their huge empire. The situation of the Achaemenid Empire is particularly instructive. Through plunder, tribute, and production from mines within its territory, the empire didn't lack for gold and silver, but much of that gold and silver was hoarded by the Achaemenid kings, who accumulated it primarily in the central treasure. Susa, Ecbatana, Persepolis were perhaps up to 275,000 talents of silver value were accumulated in 336 before Alexander, and also in secondary provincial treasuries. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, a large part of this metal reserve was used to strike gold and silver coins in order to pay his soldiers and those of his successors of the next 3 decades. The silver of the Alexander tetrarchs came from Laurian and northern Greece, which shows that the accumulation of precious metal by the great king is not a myth. We have the proof from physical chemical analysis of the metals. The Alexander tetrarchs, or his gold coinage, was minted from the reserves of the great king that came from Aegean Greece, from Laurian. It's extraordinary, if you like. The Achaemenid kings minted the gold coinage, the daric, and the silver one, the siglos, but it was mainly used only in Asia Minor, in the western part of the empire. Mesopotamia, although it was the richest and most advanced part of the empire, remained a world of weighed silver. The kings never bothered to introduce a coinage to circulate in the eastern regions of their kingdom, and this negatively impacted the velocity of money. Silver remained entirely a form of private money. The king levied taxes in cash, but also in kind and in labor, and in the form of corvée. Cash circulated for all kinds of payments, public and private, but given the relative scarcity of silver, prices were much lower than in Greece, as shown by Van der Spek and Van Loven. And by contrast, the interest rates were much higher. No less important, beyond the king, the existence of Achaemenid magnates and of large temples that played a major role in economic activity created a highly inegalitarian world in which silver circulated through channels very different from the legally egalitarian ones of the Greek cities. Powerful firms of entrepreneurs, financiers, and moneylenders, such as the Egibi, around 600, between 600 and the beginning of the 5th century, and the Murashu in the 5th century, were active in the Neo-Babylonian and Achaemenid periods, playing the roles of intermediaries between the temples, local magnates, and the state. But as a result, not only was silver scarcer and more valuable in Mesopotamia than in Greece, which per se increased the propensity to save it, money was rare, so you tend to keep it for yourself, but it was also concentrated in far fewer hands, just like the famous moneylenders or financiers, the Egibi or the Murashu. For these reasons, moneylenders enjoyed a market advantage, and interest rates not only remained much higher than those in Athens, but the gap widened in the 4th century when they climbed from around 20% to 40% compared to an average of 12% in Athens in this period. So interest rates were more than 3 times higher in Mesopotamia than in Greece in the 4th century BCE. And it gives you, obviously, it was a great economic advantage for the Greek cities. My conclusion now. Of course, the multiplicity and fragmentation of the sources of credit in the ancient Greek world differed profoundly from the more unified and much more powerful credit organization of modern capitalist economy. But in the context of ancient economies, if we come back to the time in the ancient Mediterranean, the efficiency of this system is measured by the much lower interest rates it could offer as compared to Mesopotamia and Egypt, which was a stimulus to economic growth. Thank you.